Hijack's over, half the passengers want to stay in Britain. 21 are under arrest. Jack Straw wants all of them sent home. Interest rates are up. It's bad for business, say the manufacturers. And a government report admits the NHS needs thousands more beds. Good evening. 4 days after it began, Britain's longest hijack crisis is over. At 3 o'clock this morning, a group of women and children stepped off the plane they'd boarded in Afghanistan last Sunday. By 6, all those on the plane were in police custody. During the day, detectives have been trying to find out just how many of those on board were involved in the hijack. 74 passengers have applied for asylum. But the Home Secretary, Jack Straw, pledged to consider the applications personally and said that he was determined to send a clear message that no one should benefit from hijacking. From Stansted, Gavin Hewitt reports.
The first indication that the hijacking might be ending came at 2 o'clock this morning, when unusually the cabin lights came on. Moments later, a man came down the back steps and collected a package left by the police. This contained two-way radios to help complete final negotiations. Shortly after, 2 of the hijackers left the plane for a face-to-face meeting with the police. The hijackers wanted reassurances about their safety. Then, just after 3 in the morning, police vehicles moved to the steps of the plane. Marksmen could be seen training their guns on the door. Then, a woman appeared, the tiny shape of 2 children, until a line of veiled women and their families spread out against the bitter wind blowing off the Essex countryside. Then, just before 6 o'clock, a second group of men filed from the plane, some with their hands in the air. The police had wanted to separate the men from the women to make identifying the hijackers easier. Some were forced to lie on the ground before being marched away. Then the process began of deciding who were hostages, who were hijackers, and who might be friends of the hijackers. All were searched for weapons.
We've recovered 4 handguns, 5 knives, 1 knuckle duster, 2 detonators, and 2 grenades, but the grenades do not appear to have fuses in them.
As soon as it was light, forensic teams began examining the plane. All baggage was removed to see what it might reveal about the motives of passengers who were supposed to be on a short, internal flight. The inside of the 727 was found to be relatively tidy.
It's not in much disorder as we might have anticipated. It's remarkably quiet on there in terms of the amount of rubbish and debris there. We've taken that all away as it's been developing.
It was yet another indication that this was a different kind of hijacking. Incredibly, it was only in the final hour before the hijackers walked down the steps of the plane here that they began talking about anything that could vaguely be regarded as a motive. They suddenly mentioned the political situation back home in Afghanistan. The hostages were taken to an airport hotel. Some appeared relieved, even relaxed, after 4 days and nights inside a cramped plane. A woman without her veil, talking to her friend. Others looked out on a strange land that some at least want to make their home.
They're very tired, they're exhausted. They've been on the plane obviously for many hours, and they're quite relieved, I think, to be off the plane, and they're in comfortable surroundings now, but certainly exhausted, I think is the word.
This appears to have been an organised bid for political asylum, an elaborate plan to escape the harsh fundamentalist regime of the Taliban. 21 people have been arrested. 60 passengers with 14 children have already asked for asylum. Those not suspected of involvement in this hijacking will be able to return to Afghanistan tomorrow on a charter plane. No one will be forced to leave immediately. Those who stay will be looked after by social services whilst their cases are considered. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Stansted.
The Home Secretary, Jack Straw, said he wanted all those who arrived on the Afghan plane removed from this country. In Afghanistan, the Taliban government praised Britain's handling of the crisis and called for the hijackers to be dealt with under British or international law. Our special correspondent, Ben Brown, looks at the prospects for the passengers and the hijackers.
This is the 4-star Hilton Hotel where passengers from the hijacked plane are now being put up. The rooms here can cost around £200 a night. It's a far cry from war-torn and poverty-stricken Afghanistan. But the asylum seekers won't be staying long in Britain if the Home Secretary has his way. Today he said that he personally will vet their applications. His aim is to send them straight back home.
I am determined that nobody should consider that there can be any benefit to be obtained by hijacking. Subject to compliance with all legal requirements, I would wish to see removed from this country all those on the plane as soon as reasonably practicable.
But the opposition want to know why the hijacked plane came to Britain in the first place. Was it because we're considered a soft touch?
Why did it decide that it would land here and try and take advantage of our asylum procedures? Is it that those procedures are known to be rather more congenial than some which appertain in other countries?
The men who carried out the last hijack at Stansted are still in Britain 4 years on. They were Iraqis who claimed they were seeking refuge from Saddam Hussein. They were cleared by the Court of Appeal, but the lawyer for some of them insists theirs is no life of luxury.
One of the gentlemen is actually living with friends, basically on the floor. He's in receipt of food vouchers to the value of approximately £30, which is the only thing that he's actually receiving. It doesn't enable him to travel anywhere. He's unable to seek employment, which has restricted him. He has no relatives here. He's basically living a very isolated life.
Even so, it may be better than life in Afghanistan, which has endured 2 decades of civil war, which is one of the poorest nations on earth, and which is ruled by a hardline Islamic regime, the Taliban. Since they came to power, the number of Afghans seeking asylum here in Britain has soared from a few hundred in 1996 to nearly 4,000 last year. Only a fraction of these have actually been given the status of refugees, but significantly many are told they have a temporary right to stay. Under police guard tonight, the Afghans here in Stansted will each have to prove they would be persecuted if they go back home. The asylum seekers now face a nervous wait to find out whether or not they can stay in Britain. If indeed they had seen this country as a soft touch, then the Home Secretary is determined to prove them wrong. The last thing he wants is for this bizarre episode to set a precedent and for Stansted to become the hijack capital of the world. Ben Brown, BBC News, Stansted Airport.
The Bank of England has raised interest rates by 0.25% to 6%. The rise has apparently been prompted by fears that a buoyant housing market and consumer spending could lead to higher inflation. Business leaders say the rise will make it even harder for British exporters to sell their goods abroad. Mortgage lenders are reviewing their rates.
Inflation isn't threatening this business, high interest rates are. Today's rise to 6% is intended to keep prices under control, yet the impact of that rise is felt in companies which are not the remotest inflationary threat. In the shoe industry, prices have actually been falling for the past 2 years. Yet, not only will today's interest rate rise make this company's borrowing more expensive, but it keeps the value of sterling painfully high. It's risen by more than 10% against the euro in the past year.
Our exports are something like 11% more expensive in the markets in Europe, and imports from Europe are potentially 11% less expensive coming into our market.
You're losing both ways?
We're losing both ways.
This is where to find the inflationary forces that have the Bank of England worried. Across Britain, house prices are rising at 16% a year. These new homes in Northampton were all sold before they'd been completed. And there's no sign yet that the 4 recent interest rate rises have had much effect upon demand.
Well, we've certainly not seen any impact, and I think that that's unlikely to happen while the supply is being outstripped by demand to the extent that it is.
The boss of the CBI was at a paint factory in Manchester today, at another company that's grappling with the high interest rates aimed at cooling demand in a quite separate part of the economy. He asked the Bank of England not to raise the cost of borrowing today, but his words fell on deaf ears.
I do fear that they are still concerned about inflationary pressures in the economy, but I have to say I've seen no evidence today of inflationary pressures in wages or in factory gate prices. It's not existing.
The Bank of England is raising interest rates to confront a threat of inflation that lies a year or more ahead. For companies facing persistent deflation, The problem of interest rates set at almost twice the Eurozone level are very much in the here and now. Peter Morgan, BBC News, Northamptonshire.
Northern Ireland's First Minister David Trimble has said that the peace process is not in terminal crisis. He was speaking in Dublin after meeting the Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern. But Downing Street has confirmed that Northern Ireland's Assembly and Executive are likely to be suspended tomorrow unless there's progress on the handover of terrorist weapons. Russian forces have launched a major offensive on rebel positions in Chechnya's southern mountains. They've directed airstrikes and heavy artillery at the rebels' mountain strongholds, while Russian paratroops took key positions on high ground. The rebels say heavy fighting is now going on in the Argun Gorge. Our correspondent, Orla Guerin, reports.
There is a new battleground in Chechnya. Now the war is raging in the mountains of the south. The Kremlin is pouring in tanks and troops. Moscow is pounding the rebels in their strongholds, an all-out attack on the ground and from the air. Russia wants this to be the last stop on the road to victory. But thousands of Chechen fighters are holed up here, and they could resist for months. The fight for Grozny is over, and people are coming home to a living hell. This is no place to start again, not here among the ruins with little or nothing, but desperate and war-weary, many have nowhere else to go. And this is what they're coming back to. Moscow did its worst here to force out the rebels. There is simply nothing left. What are we going to do? She asks. Who will help us? My life is over. This is torture. A Russian commander is attacked by angry women. Don't shout at me, he says. I'm one of you. But the women won't forgive what has been done here. The Kremlin does not ask forgiveness for all this destruction. The price of victory against terrorists, it says. But civilians here argue that they have suffered far more than the rebels. Chechnya has been devastated by 5 months of war. In many areas, little has been left standing. It's hard to imagine how this place can ever be rebuilt. And the fighting isn't over yet, far from it. This war is still claiming more victims. Zarima spent 3 months hiding in a cellar in Grozny, watching her mother die of TB. Now she too is desperately ill with the same disease. We had to negotiate with the Russians to get out, she says. By then I couldn't even stand up. Zarima's doctors say it is already too late to save this gentle young girl of 16. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Chechnya.
Royal Bank of Scotland is poised to take over one of Britain's best-known high street names, NatWest Bank. The Royal Bank has been fighting its rival Bank of Scotland for control of NatWest for over 4 months. Today, key investors backed the Royal Bank's bid.
On Edinburgh St Andrews Square, NatWest's 2 Scottish predators stand side by side. But after months of battle, it's the Royal Bank of Scotland which appears to have triumphed. The Bank of Scotland sent a memo to its staff conceding defeat. Major shareholders like Standard Life, another Edinburgh financial powerhouse, have put their weight behind the Royal Bank's bid.
Their strategy for managing the enlarged group was seen to be superior to that of the Bank of Scotland. So it was seen as a better bank to take the broader business forward.
The NatWest is still insisting shareholders have until Monday to decide, but the city is already working out what could happen to the banking league table. A takeover would propel the Royal Bank of Scotland up that table. The biggest bank is HSBC, valued by the stock market at £60 billion. Lloyds TSB is worth £38 billion, and combining the Royal Bank with NatWest creates a £27 billion bank, ahead of Barclays, which is valued at £23 billion. The bank, created in the 60s by a merger between the Westminster and the National and Provincial, came to dominate Britain's high streets. But in recent years, the NatWest has lost ground to its rivals. The Royal Bank of Scotland's Grand Edinburgh headquarters may date back more than 200 years, but it has a reputation for modern, efficient management. While NatWest is refusing to concede defeat, Edinburgh is confident tonight that it'll soon be home to a major new force in banking. But the Royal Bank of Scotland now has to prove it can deliver on its promise to cut £1 billion in costs from NatWest without harming service. Rory Catlin-Jones, BBC News, Edinburgh.
The acting First Secretary for Wales, Rhodri Morgan, says he might consider striking a deal with the Liberal Democrats. A day after Alan Michael's resignation, Mr Morgan's been holding talks with opposition parties in the Assembly. He says he wants to see constructive relations between all the parties. MPs have voted overwhelmingly to lower the age of consent for homosexual men in England and Wales from 18 to 16. The legislation was blocked by the House of Lords last year, but ministers say that if peers try to block it again, they'll use powers contained in the Parliament Act to force it through. An extra 4,000 hospital beds are needed in England over the next 4 years, and that's according to the government's own findings. The number of NHS beds in England has fallen dramatically over the past 40 years, from 250,000 in 1960 to 147 last year. Today's report says most of the beds are occupied by the elderly. It suggests that more resources should go into intermediate care beds to help elderly people cope on their own. The report predicts that 25,000 more beds will be needed by 2020. Neil Dixon has been to the East Surrey Hospital to see how NHS managers juggle the demand for beds.
Another patient for East Surrey Hospital, another admission too many. Margaret Segner has fallen and banged her head. In a few days, she'll be 100 years old. As ever, the NHS is there to help, but this is a system under pressure. Routine operations have been cancelled, and some patients have to wait for treatment.
Since the weekend, we've seen a large increase in the amount of emergency admissions through the department, in fact double the number. This has resulted in a strain on the A&E department itself and on the rest of the hospital. We've had to open up extra beds in areas, and we've had to put patients into different specialty beds, which is not ideal, obviously.
Up in intensive care, it's a similar story.
How's it been overnight?
Very stable.
Every week they have to turn away desperately sick people because they don't have enough beds. Recently, one ended up in Great Yarmouth, 150 miles from here. The NHS has become a victim of its own success. It can now save lives that once would have been lost.
In the last 5 to 10 years, we've been able to offer patients operations who had previously been considered not fit enough to undergo major surgery. And that's good news for patients, but in terms of the resources that we have to provide, these patients are patients who require very intensive post-operative care.
If it were just a question of providing more beds, it would all be relatively easy. Even here in intensive care, where the equipment is very expensive, the hospital could probably afford a few more machines. The real challenge is in the staffing. It costs £250,000 a year to provide enough nurses just to cover one intensive care bed.
You want to have a look through the menu and see what you fancy?
And even if the NHS can pay for extra staff, it still has to recruit them. In this hospital alone, 1 in 5 nursing posts is vacant. One solution to relieve the pressure would be to provide more support in the community. Around 30 elderly patients here are just waiting for places in residential homes. Again, it comes down to money.
The demand for the care within the community, both within patients' own home and the provision and the funding of residential care when such cares are required, is not adequate at the moment.
Providing more beds, as the government wants, whether in hospitals or convalescent units, will require time, money and reorganisation. In the meantime, patients must continue to endure a system that is coping, but only just. Neil Dixon, BBC News, East Surrey Hospital.
At least 38 people have died and more than 100,000 made homeless in floods in South Africa. It follows the country's heaviest rainfall for 50 years. The worst affected areas are in the northeast of the country and around Johannesburg.
South Africa's biggest attraction, the world-famous Kruger National Park, without its tourists. They've been evacuated and parts of the park closed for the first time in a century. It's rained solidly for 5 days now and damage is still being done. Most of the animals escaped to high ground, but their rangers don't know how they'll rebuild the park.
Now we're starting to become even more sober in terms of what we will be spending. Of course, we'll be spending money that we don't have in terms of replacing or restoring the infrastructure, so it's quite mind-boggling.
It's not going to be easy here either, in Johannesburg's poor black shanty towns. People here have been hardest hit. The repair bill will be huge when the government is struggling to build new homes with the little cash it has. But for now, some people are just grateful to be alive. Without the ropes and the police, this woman would have been washed into what's now a river running past her home. There's been some time for salvage and repair work and brief respite from the downpour. But that's little consolation to these people. And the weather forecasters are now saying that they should brace themselves for several more days of heavy rain and more damage. And Johannesburg's main dam is barely coping. The authorities have just begun evacuating people living nearby, afraid that more homes could soon be underwater. Jane Standley, BBC News, Johannesburg.
John Barnes has been sacked as manager of Celtic Football Club after just 8 months in the job. His contract was cut short after a poor run culminated in Celtic being knocked out of the Tennent Scottish Cup by a First Division side.
Throughout the day, a small band of Celtic supporters who'd called for John Barnes to be sacked waited outside Parkhead for news of the club's intentions. The club finally confirmed this evening that Barnes had been sacked as head coach, that his 2 assistants went with him. Ironically, Kenny Dalglish, the man who urged the Celtic board to take on Barnes, will now act as stand-in coach. And there was this pointed warning for the playing staff.
The players have to look at themselves and they have to realise that this club demands passion and commitment. I think the supporters there would demand that the people who play for Celtic and wear that shirt should wear it very proudly indeed. If they don't want to wear it, they don't need to bother coming to their work.
What ultimately cost Barnes his job was the humiliating defeat by Inverness Caledonian Thistle on Tuesday night and the dressing room divisions it exposed, with rumours of a bust-up with one of the senior players. It brings an abrupt end to Barnes' so-called dream team partnership with Dalglish, which promised so much at the beginning of the season. In December, Barnes was manager of the month, but recent performances left the board and supporters short on patience.
I feel as if we really need continuity and stability at the club. The sooner the better, and Barnes had no option to go.
Oh, he had to go. I feel sorry for the man, definitely feel sorry for him, because he was made a scapegoat by the 2 of them that's still up there.
Kenny Dalglish says the priority now is to appoint a new head coach of high quality, but the fans' demands are rather more pressing. They want a marked improvement on the pitch as soon as possible. Paul Newman, BBC News at Parkhead.
The Free Church of Scotland, known for its strict teachings, has been split by a row involving its leading figures. The church, known as the Wee Frees, is small but influential in the Highlands and Islands, with its rigorous observance of the Sabbath. But some 30 ministers have now broken away to form a new church, dividing congregations and even families.
It's remote and insular in places, a harsh land which has helped shape fundamental religious beliefs. But the last decade has seen major economic and cultural change in the Highlands and Islands. This is the heartland of the Free Church of Scotland, and it's now having to embrace a new century. It's a small, uncompromising Protestant church with some 15,000 followers, but these worshippers have left. This is a rebel congregation. Almost every Free Church minister here on Skye has walked out. Tonight the rebels have come together to pray for their future. In this small corner of the UK, religion is all-encompassing, but some Wee Frees are more conservative than others. These older worshippers believe the Free Church is compromising tradition and discipline.
I've been 24 years a minister of the Free Church. I love the Free Church. I've been born and bred in it. But there were falling standards, and things were being brushed under the carpet. We had to leave, we were forced out.
Ministers like Willie McLeod have left the Free Church over how its leaders handled a controversial court case involving a Liberal colleague. But this bitter split is really about the future direction of the church, and it's divided congregations, communities, even families.
I waited
For John Gillis and his young family, religion is a way of life. They've stayed with the official Free Church, but their parents have left with the rebel minister.
It is a great shame and loss, the fact that we aren't worshipping together as a family, where our own children are, as it were, taken, worshipping in a church separate from where my own parents are and their grandparents. But we've got to remember there's a lot more families in the situation we are.
This is John's minister, Kenny MacDonald, returning to his family home in Skye, brought out of retirement and dispatched by the official Free Church to hold the fort. He's having to preach in a local school, but says the message hasn't changed.
We don't look back, we look forward, we look ahead. We've only got a little time left, the whole lot of us, and the message is urgent, the time is short, and we've got to do and catch up on any lost ground that we may have lost.
This is a church born out of division. There may be legal battles ahead over church property and posts, but for both sides perhaps the real issue is long-term survival and influence. Emma Simpson, BBC News, Skye.
The main news tonight, 4 days after it began, the Stansted hijack is over. That's the latest from the BBC Newsroom this evening. Good night.
You can stay in touch with all the news as it happens 24 hours a day with the BBC News team on BBC News 24.
Good evening. The Bank of Scotland has admitted defeat in its ambitious plans to take over the NatWest. Support for the bid of its rival, the Royal Bank, has continued to grow after the lead was set by 3 of NatWest's biggest shareholders yesterday. The likelihood is that the new group will create Scotland's biggest company yet.
In Edinburgh, the two banks may sit side by side, but tonight the gap between winner and loser was widening. As the Royals sat poised for victory, the Bank of Scotland was bracing itself for defeat. Earlier, it had sent a memo to all staff stating that it appeared to have lost the battle for NatWest, although it stopped short of withdrawing its bid. For the victor, winning the support of shareholders is only the first hurdle.
This is a big bank which has been poorly run for years. The Royal Bank will go in there and do their best to make sure everything works, and they'll have to do it quickly, because if you don't do it quickly, morale in the bank will fall.
The Royal charged ahead today as more shareholders came out in favour of its bid. Others who'd earlier supported the Bank of Scotland jumped ship to make sure a clear winner emerged. As the bank began to look more like the loser, talk turned to whether it would become a takeover target itself.
Celtic Football Club has confirmed that they've sacked manager John Barnes. It follows the club's premature and humiliating exit from the Scottish Cup on Tuesday night. However, the other half of the partnership, Kenny Dalglish, has survived. He's to be put in charge on a temporary basis.
John Barnes' 8-month reign as Celtic head coach ended today when he was relieved of his duties with immediate effect. Also leaving Parkhead are his backroom staff, Eric Black and Terry McDermott. Barnes paid the price for a run of form which saw Celtic fail to record a win since December the 18th and culminated in the club's worst ever result last Tuesday when Inverness Caley Thistle knocked him out of the Scottish Cup at Parkhead. Today, Kenny Dalglish, who will take charge of the side at Dundee on Saturday, had this warning for players who are not committed to the Celtic cause.
All we ask for, which I don't think is too much, is 100% commitment, 100% effort, and I don't think that's asking too much of anyone. We can accept bad results, we can accept bad performances, but we'll never ever accept anything other than 100% effort from the club.
There was no hint as to who would replace Barnes, but two old favourites have emerged as contenders, with Tommy Burns and Wim Jansen both being tipped to return. And an outside bet could be Stuart Baxter, currently at AIK Stockholm.
There's been a call for a full-scale inquiry into the running of East Ayrshire Council's social work department. It follows the discovery of an elderly man's body, which is believed to have lain undiscovered in a council-run hostel for a week. A warden who was supposed to be looking after 67-year-old John McCabe signed off sick 5 months ago. It comes shortly after an East Ayrshire social worker and a teacher left a boy with behavioural difficulties alone in a lay-by. That's all from us for now. We'll be back on BBC Two with Newsnight Scotland. For now, good night.